When the world looks at you and looks at your life, there should be no accusation of offense that should stick except the gospel. Because the gospel is offensive enough to our culture. Can we just be honest about that point? The gospel is offensive to our culture. Here's what the gospel says. You're not enough. And what you deeply feel like you ought to be and what you ought to do and what your calling is in your life, it's actually at its most fundamental level sinful. And you can't get yourself out of this. You're stuck. And the only way out is somebody outside of that has got to reach in and pull you out of that. And that person that does that is Jesus. But anyone who tells you that there's another path is wrong. That whole thing is offensive enough in our culture today. So why add to that offense? This is why Peter says we do all this with gentleness, and we do this with respect. And you've likely caught a potential contradiction here. He's like, okay, the gospel is you can't do this. You're not enough. You need to, you're sinful in your narcissistic tendencies. And Peter says, then I want you to live a life with no accusation of offense that will stick, right? Seems like a contradiction, but it's not. Look at verse 18. It says, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all. He handled it all. The righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit. You were unrighteous, and Jesus made you righteous. He brought you to God. And so harmony and unity and like-mindedness is all about having the same thing at the center of our lives, Jesus. He's saying we ought to have that sort of affection toward one another, all of us. Now, if we're honest, we barely have that type of affection for like a handful of people. And they're usually people who look and dress and sound and act just like us. But this ought to be what makes us different as followers of Jesus. What happens is by being like-minded on the gospel, our affections, our love, our compassion, our sympathy ripples out from us to people who are very, very unlike us. In fact, that's what Jesus says to his disciples. He said, they will know that you are my followers if you have love for one another. You know what that's going to take? The very next thing that he mentions, to be humble. To be humble means to rank yourself beneath another. It's the beauty of the gospel of Jesus.